Hi there, I'm Hugo Worthy, and this is Dan Kelly, and this is the sixth part of our Universes program. Universes is a series of conversations taking place between practitioners, artists, and theorists, exploring ideas around universe creation as a social mode and as an artistic practice, and the ways it can be deployed to create imaginary futures which help us to articulate some of the challenges that face us at the moment. The program has been curated by Dan, and today we're going to talk a bit about Dan's research and practice around ideas of universe creation, of futuring, and of fandom, and I think also talk perhaps to some of the conversations that have taken place already. Before this began, I think I was saying to Dan that we might like to think about this as a kind of user's manual for the previous conversations that have taken place. All of them have this kind of linked relationship with ideas of universe and world building. But what they emphasize is the diversity in those practices, the differences that exist within this kind of broad idea of creating and building fictions. And perhaps some of what we talk through today will allow us ways into those different areas. So maybe to start, actually the most useful thing would be for you to talk a bit about your research and your interest in this area, Dan.
Yeah. So the background of this comes out of this dissertation that I wrote in 2019 for a master's that I was doing contemporary art theory at Goldsmiths, and the subject of that thesis ended up being around this idea of the universe as a sort of form or a kind of diagram that is used in popular culture, but also pops up occasionally in contemporary art practices. And yeah, I suppose the writing of that thesis was the product of a sort of like almost sort of lifelong interest in sort of trying to slot in and locate instances where X occurs in the same universe as Y. Like this sort of formation seemed to be a thing in the sort of popular culture and genre fiction and science fiction that I have enjoyed as a child, and that I feel has sort of like produced my mindset in some way, is this idea that culture is produced in universes that are not necessarily as distinct as the form of a world. We can maybe go into some of those kind of differentiations in a bit more detail, but that a universe is a kind of cultural formation that's capable of hosting multiple works of fiction or art by multiple authors, and kind of raises questions about authorship and canon and kind of, you know, what becomes accepted canon, accepted mythology, kind of who has authority over the production of artworks within a universe form. So these were the kind of things that I went into the project with the intention of trying to uncover. And so yeah, since the completion of that thesis, which I think, again, we can sort of talk more detail about this sort of there's a kind of layer of political utility that was an intention in the work, and I think which I now feel somewhat differently about, given kind of a year of quite an unusual year that we've had, and like all the things that's thrown up. But yeah, so that was the kind of intention in the work, and it's interesting now to revisit it throughout this summer through this series of talks, and alongside that I've been kind of revisiting the work and reposting it on my blog and developing it a little bit and adding sections.
I think the area of universe creation that you were talking about and are talking about feels really, it felt relevant before we went into kind of lockdown in the current context, but actually that sort of exacerbated the sense of its significance in the way people are working. And I guess there are kind of like 2 or 3 aspects to it that I'm particularly interested in. So one of them is about this kind of idea of shared authorship, shared space, and the way community is generated through these ideas, through a sort of shared set of rules that constitutes a universe. But I think I'm also really interested in this idea of a kind of immanence of the audience in this process, so that presence of the audience as participant and practitioner and producer becomes really significant. And at the same time, there's this kind of radical absence of the audience member. And I guess I'm particularly thinking of which has been an important strand of role-play game structures, where actually the individual audience member is in some ways deliberately made absent from the process. So 2 things, it's kind of like a sense of community that starts to develop through these practices and shared rules. And I think kind of in the world of like mainstream fandom, you can see where that becomes radically and very unattractively politicized, as well as much more optimistic kind of models. And then also where that sense of community usurps the individual, and the individual is kind of removed from that kind of universe.
Yeah, I suppose the kind of real sort of basic background of the thinking around it is to do with the kind of political context that neoliberalism creates, in which individuals feel atomized and fragmented and incapable of political agency, or the sort of community structures that are built around workplaces have been eroded. So essentially some of the kind of political optimism of the project was thinking about whether in the sort of mid around kind of 2015, it seemed like there was a lot of talk about the idea of needing to find a new collective political subject, and that this was the kind of the thing that the left was missing was essentially the kind of fragmented environment that digital technologies have produced, the sort of and that allied with the kind of social attitudes that neoliberalism has implanted within us, has resulted in this situation where the left, that had traditionally been reliant on kind of social activism, was left fragmented and unable to kind of respond constructively to a right which acts in a much more kind of policy-making direction. So these were the things that were coming out of particularly a book called Inventing the Future by Alex Williams and Nick Cernchek that came out around that period. But now I think feels to me like the left sort of managed to build a kind of swell of social movement optimism around Corbynism in this country or Sanders in America, but that both of those things have now been kind of knocked back, and that maybe this sort of like vaunted idea of social movement as the sort of panacea of the left has not really materialised. So the position that this work comes from, even though I was still in that kind of optimistic mindset at this point last summer, but is still to think about the ways that online communities and fandoms that grow around games or sci-fi franchises, they represent a kind of novel form of community in which agreement is not really a prerequisite. Like overwriting the work of others, or kind of conflict is in some way inbuilt within those structures and doesn't negate their effectiveness. So you kind of see that in, I suppose, well, the kind of biggest outlets for this kind of thing that you can find. I mean, there's an organisation called AO3 who kind of archive fan-produced fictions and fan art and fan films and stuff. But there's a kind of, on the part of a fan who feels so inspired by fiction or an artwork that they must produce something themselves. For one thing, there's a desire to expand the canon and kind of fill in the gaps that are left sort of occluded within a film or a universe. So there's a desire to kind of fill those things, but there's also like a disregard for the original author's sort of tight grip over who's allowed to add things into this canon. And also that other fans can all be kind of contributing to this sort of mass work. But they never, they may never meet another fan of the kind of niche thing that they are so inspired by. So that I was thinking, about this kind of idea of like, it kind of drew upon Nicolas Bourriet's relational aesthetics, but thinking about forms of relational aesthetics that are not reliant on two people being in the same room as each other, and how that is not that system is not necessarily reliant on. It's not necessarily about community or conviviality, which are the things that it's usually has become a shorthand for in kind of art institutions. So, the community usurps the idea of the individual, you said. So, I mean, I think it's in some way there to do with like the idea of ego or something. That's not necessarily something I've written about, but the fan is not necessarily trying to declare themselves as a sort of author figure, more that they see themselves as part of a given fandom, or like that's clearly what they are working within. But also that to be a fan is in some way to act as though you are the fiction, you are the artwork, like much more than say when I write a Star Wars fan fiction, like I'm become George Lucas. It's more that I become Star Wars, or I gift some part of my subjectivity over to the thing that I love so much.
Is it possible to exist in fandom without that love? I mean, I think that you use the phrase, very memorable phrase, in your thesis of being the fan is autist and onanist.
Yeah.
And there's something really. Our assumption is love, but actually it's a more complicated relationship that the fan has with the subject. And again, whether in the context of Star Wars fandom or something which is kind of closer to sort of visual arts production, where you have kind of universe building, then it's not. There's a resentment there as well, isn't there? There's a kind of pushing against the edges of that universe and a frustration. And
that was one of the things that I was really interested in, is the idea that even if the franchise, the canon, the pre-existing thing actively resists the fans' love, that acts only as an encouragement for more of the same. and really, so this was kind of, a breakthrough in my thinking, was that I think often where artworks or works of culture attempt to incorporate the viewer or the audience as a kind of attempt to encourage authorship or sort of interactivity on a basic level, that normally falls down, because where those works are reliant on a certain kind of prescribed interactivity, and they prescribe the boundaries of what is acceptable play within the space of the work. But that actually I was more interested in the idea that rather than trying to immerse an audience through inviting that cooperation, the instances where it's usually more effective is where a world feels very complete, has a very aesthetically finite boundary, and those are the universes where that in itself acts as a kind of invitation, like make something else in this. But yeah, Star Wars is a good example where for a long time there was a lot of very active resistance to fans trying to make fan films or try to expand the backstory of characters and things like that. So yeah, your question was about love. That's something that's come out this year as I've been kind of expanding the work, is to do with this original sense of the word amateur being a lover, and that was the term that was the lover was a term that was used throughout kind of early modernity for, say, like collectors who would assemble Wunderkammer, or like early art collectors, essentially. But in that sense, to be a collector, I think, is like quite a different thing from being a fan. Like, it doesn't to be a fan doesn't require you to be a completist or to have seen everything. You could see one image, and that could be enough to generate an idea of the universe. And I think that's what the most effective artwork does, is it kind of, without having to be a 2.5-hour film or a set of 10 2.5-hour films, like a single image can be enough to sort of conjure an ontological space, like, and to invite the viewer to
populate it.
Yeah.
So you talk about the artwork having the capacity to generate a universe around it, and I guess there's something interesting there for me, because it seems to presume the artwork is an image, and that suggests a certain kind of model and practice. But your practice as an artist is embedded primarily in painting. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Primarily,
rather,
I think, image making really is.
It'd be really interesting for me to hear a little bit about how you feel that your practice correlates to this kind of the idea of universe creation.
Yeah. I think, first of all, that's interesting. I think I don't necessarily think that it is an image-bound idea. I think that works of music or performance, or trying to think what are the other bounds of like non-image based artistic practices. I think it's possible for those things to also do this. But in terms of the origins of me being interested enough about this to want to kind of interrogate it as a writer, are in my painting practice. But I think, interestingly, what I try to do there is I'm more interested in the opposite operation. So I'm very keen. The images and paintings that I make, a lot of people would attempt to kind of draw out a sort of narrative thread throughout the works, or to kind of that they suggest that a world is being played out within those works. But I'm really keen to not make that world or universe too contingent or coherent. And I'm really keen that, because I'm not really a fan of artistic practices that rest on that, where it is a case of kind of, I have made this world, these are these are the people in that world, this is the map of the world. I think that is kind of doing the same operation as an interactive work that prescribes the boundaries of play in some way. But also that I'm more interested in the things that we encounter in our world that are kind of ontological breakages, things that don't make sense, that we can't fit into the operation of, that our brains kind of make sense of the world and these other things within it. I'm more interested in the things that puncture through that, and artworks as a good example of a kind of object that misbehaves, or so usually I feel like this research project was almost kind of like a first part of kind of thinking about this is a way that popular culture has become quite preoccupied with this kind of universe building for various reasons. So you could kind of say that cynically that's to do with creating reliable consumers who will return to a product, a franchise.
I don't think it's remotely cynical.
I think definitely in terms of contemporary Hollywood, that seems pretty clearly the motivation is that, particularly in terms of things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the kind of big slew of kind of like backstory dramas that have appeared on Netflix in the last few years, where it's like it seems no longer acceptable to leave a blank, leave a gap in a world that it's a kind of well established thought that, if you, for example, sort of horror films, the horror comes from the unseen parts, and I think much of what Hollywood in particular is attempting to do is remove all of those unseen parts. And I think, so partially that is motivated by the worst aspects of contemporary fandom, which are, really keen to know everything possible about a given character and their backstory. And so where did we come from?
So I think that brings me back to this idea of the image.
Yeah.
And that there's a kind of, the idea of the image cleaves really closely to the idea of the narrative. And that perhaps what you're talking about with your practice and what opens up with models of universe creation as a part of kind of an artistic practice through whatever disciplines that might be, is that it allows that kind of image base to be diluted so that it's less dependent on that. Whereas, as you say, at kind of the extreme end of fandom, kind of in pop cultural fandom, is this kind of very literal, image-heavy, narrative-heavy, increased understanding of the world. Understanding is the wrong phrase, but a kind of this endless, linear journey that people are on to extend that universe without necessarily taking it anywhere. And I think that idea of kind of coherence becomes part of that as well. And those kind of intersecting coherences between universes. And I guess for me, then I'm really interested in the way universe creation works, and kind of coming back to some of the talks that we've had. So you've talked about the kind of the prescriptiveness of universe creation, and Tom's practice in terms of creating roleplay games is both very open, but also very prescriptive at the same time. There are clear parameters for openness.
Yeah.
And I think also really interestingly, Bridget and talks around liquidity kind of move through metaphor, tonal ideas around liquidity, literal representations of liquidity, and that seems to be a really powerful kind of way of thinking about a world or a universe, that you're taking a kind of equality which is then applied across it. And that's fundamentally different to that narrative or imagistic impulse that exists in kind of pop cultural ideas of universe creation. But I think also there's something really interesting about the way narrative is applied in terms of maybe community building. So in Danielle Braithwaite Shirley's talk and in her work, so the Black Trans Archive, there's a very clear delimiting of an idea of community. It's a very focused group who are being talked to. And that seems to me, again, quite interesting in terms of an understanding of what universes can do. So that quite image-based idea of a universe creates a particular fandom, I guess, sort of built in its image to a certain extent. So I think, I've become really interested in that. The capacity, exactly that kind of question, you were challenging that idea that I'd suggested, that kind of universes are image-based. But actually what happens is you move away from that image-based model of the universe, or that narrative model of the universe, so towards liquid worlds, as opposed to Star Wars.
The things that I ended up being much more interested in were the instances where not only have fans created work within pre-given universes, but also where fans attempt to pervert that process so that the most, you'll see this a lot in a kind of fan theory dimension where it's like, could Mario and Zelda be the same universe? And then someone will write their fan theory of why these things coexist. So it's about those universes, and this is kind of why I'm less interested in the idea of worlds, because I think the world building suggests to me quite a delineated diagram of this kind of quite closed thing, where the universe is more porous but also capable of sort of magnetically drawing in other things, and it implies that essentially a kind of meta-universal diagram in which all of these universes have their connections on a level of our ontic reality. That's Hollywood is the kind of meta-universe, and the mechanisms of Hollywood are where all these things come from, or some of these things. So I was more interested in the sort of extreme end of that is a thing called the Tommy Westfall universe, which incorporates kind of most of American television from the last 50 years and suggests where these things have crossed over. So particularly, I think, in more the case in American television, there is that desire to transfer an audience from one, sitcoms particularly, sitcoms and soap operas. So in the early series of Friends, there's kind of crossover characters from another sitcom, and that was reciprocated, and the hope is that you will keep an audience or move an audience from one thing to another. but that creates a suggestion that X universe and Y universe are the same thing. So yeah, I feel more interested in this kind of liquid idea of something that is unruly, and also the practice of fans in a slightly, admittedly, in a tongue-in-cheek kind of mode, but to not respect the boundaries of where one universe ends and another one begins. But yeah, in terms of Tom's game after the Maestro, he gave a really good example that a previous role-playing game of his that he had devised in one session, so the premise of that role-playing game was that you were artists on an artist residency. And it would map out the things that would happen throughout the course of a year. And then someone suggested, oh, there's a werewolf in the basement of the studios, or whatever. And that kind of threw out the whole premise that had been built. Like, there's a particular kind of physics would be the term that is used in games. Sure. Most commonly is, what are the physics of this world? Like, is time travel acceptable? Is magic a thing here? Like, so yeah, in the games that Tom creates, and in the case of After the Maestro, he spent a bit of time mapping out, this is the kind of fiction we're trying to make here. It's a kind of cyberpunk, slightly dystopian thing, and these sort of touchstones are enough for people to kind of, there's not a strong level of prescription about what will be allowed and what won't. It's just that the context in which that's going to be enjoyable and create something interesting, or just be a bit of an annoyance, and someone could kind of irritatingly push that. But in the case of the games that Tom's devising, that's not necessarily where the interesting parts are going to come from. So yeah, in the case of After the Maestro, it's in the conversation that we had after playing the game, thinking about the genre of the body, or the kind of microcosmic body as a genre. So Tom's got a series of kind of particularly animated touchstones, like a French cartoon from the 70s, educational cartoon. Kind of many examples where the anatomy and the organs and the blood cells are anthropomorphized and represent the kind of society.
Leviathan.
So
Leviathan.
Leviathan. Yeah, Hobbes' Leviathan. And so it was interesting. Anna McFarlane, that contributed to that talk, is a researcher in the medical humanities, which is kind of an area that I haven't really thought about before. This idea that the medical represents genre in art and literature, and that's distinct from its kind of scientific applications. So yeah, I think in the case of Tom's game, this kind of mapping of parameters creates the idea that the world or the universe we are playing within is the body itself, and but in the case of the game that we played, and I think several times when Tom's played the game, players end up exiting the body out of choice. Like, seems to be a thing that happens quite a lot in the game, is people choose to leave one way or another.
It might be interesting in that context then, if we were able to talk a little bit about Angela's game in this context, where where the process of universe creation that takes place is directly correlates to real world activity and a critique of that activity.
So in the case of the conversation that Sarah, Jury and Angela had was mostly centred around a game that Angela has made called The Game, which is based on the practices of pickup artists and essentially...
It's a fascinating term, just
Yeah.
terminology.
Yeah. Yeah, pickup artists. Yeah, it's true. So the game places the player in the position of the subject who's being essentially chatted up and then pressurised into sex by a kind of predatory man in a bar, and essentially allows the player to experience what it would be like to be in the position of that subject, and perhaps kind of one sort of intention of the work might be to cause anyone who would think about practicing this kind of pickup art as, to reevaluate, to place themselves in the position of the sort of prey of the pickup artist. So yeah, in the instance of that game, there's a kind of relatively direct correlation between things that happen in our world and things that happen in the game world. And I suppose, one of the kind of common functions of game playing being to sort of live vicariously and have a different set of different set of experiences. It's just that in this case, they're maybe slightly more quotidian than a lot of computer games. I mean, there is a sort of subgenre of indie games that has that kind of quotidian experience, like Papers, Please is quite a famous one. But then, the other part of Angela's practice that she and Sarah talked about was Angela's projects within World of Warcraft. So she found a kind of group within World of Warcraft called the Council for Gender Sensitivity, which was essentially aimed at trying to... She, as a pre-existing player of World of Warcraft, had experienced a lot of insensitivity from male players, or not necessarily insensitivity, just a different form of gameplay once they knew she was a woman. Essentially that this was kind of an artwork that also was performing a real required political function within the community of World of Warcraft, was to attempt to sort of intervene and in some way educate players about, make them reappraise how they were playing the game. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. So actually, that is fundamentally an act of fandom in the way you would think about fandom. And I guess there's something quite interesting here about scale, isn't there? Kind of that actually fandom has to exist, or universes have to exist at a scale in terms of users, like Star Wars or Warcraft, for people to then kind of intervene in them and have direct input in their development, because they start to have their own moral and ethical assumptions, which aren't necessarily ideal. And so there's something quite interesting there about how those communities can be steered. And I think there's something really interesting about what you touched on earlier, this idea of kind of the isolated fan, part of a community without ever communicating within that community. And that isn't true of something like, well, Warcraft, what people do communicate, I think, pretty much by definition. I don't 100% know, but I assume. But how you can kind of work within those environments as an artist or as a practitioner or as an activist to try and engage with those groups and affect those kind of behaviours. I'm genuinely curious whether she did her intervention impact, and how that's that's tracked. So yeah, this idea of kind of scale seems to me important in the way we think about universes. By definition, kind of universes that are being generated by practitioners are closer to the scale of Tom's practice than the scale of George Lucas's practice. And that kind of changes perhaps the relationship with it. And I think, and then also the interesting you talk about kind of the meta-universe of Hollywood is then how the idea of universe cleaves to ideas around brand, and I guess around familiar ideas of experience, so that it's not a great leap to talk about Tate as a universe in exactly the way that Nintendo as a brand sets out to be a universe which deliberately creates interweaving narratives between its various intellectual properties. So yeah, I guess a question about kind of how those kind of levels of universe stack up within themselves, and where your interests lie within that. And this again comes back to kind of, I guess, a non-imagistic idea of what a universe is. That Nintendo isn't an imagistic idea of what a universe is. Hollywood isn't an imagistic idea of what a universe is. It's a set of parameters and expectations and tones that things need to kind of cohere around.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Is the kind of the idea of tone, or kind of it's the kind of subtext of what defines the products of Nintendo, or of a particular film studio or game studio. You can find and pick out tropes from within those games, for example, but it's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily define the kind of spirit in some way of what would be a Nintendo product. I mean, I suppose that essentially comes down to some level of this kind of gatekeeping process of what is permitted and what is not. That's the line of where we can see the criteria enacted, and it would be interesting to know what the things are that aren't permitted. Probably learn more from that about. I mean, I'm sure, these organisations will have a kind of list of values and sort of criteria, but that doesn't necessarily define the aesthetic affects of affect. Really, is the thing that the tone is are quite sort of indefinable and hard to pin down criteria. I think it's interesting to think about art institutions as, I suppose, again, having that kind of unspoken sets of criteria or aesthetics that they, what makes Tate different from the National Gallery, or the kind of unset criteria, and to see an art gallery or a museum collection as sort of performing the same thing, where when these artworks hang next to each other, what does that do subtextually in our brain to when we kind of devise histories of art and which paintings go in the same room.
I think so, and this is coming out Tate, I guess, as a universe, but actually then kind of looped back into all our other kind of considerations, I guess, around universe creation. Is that these universes, these structures, become vessels which we project our needs onto. So everyone legitimately unfortunately, is extremely critical of Tate for the cuts at the moment that are kind of rolling through. But I think there's a real frustration and disappointment around it because we perceive Tate as part of our universe. It's, for all its problems and challenges, we want it to embody a set of values that we kind of, and by we I kind of mean the arts sector without putting it down in any very complicated way, that we kind of embody. But actually, my parents' generation also visited Tate to see the Impressionist shows, and they wanted to embody, or for them it embodies something very different about kind of a lineage of genius in artists that I presume we don't particularly kind of like deal in anymore. But actually, all universes have that capacity, don't they? Kind of, we start to ascribe a set of values for ourselves as individuals to find them. And the more fragmented they are, the more you can kind of exist outside of that universe as an individual with a particular relationship to it, the more you're able to kind of make it do for you what you want it to do. I think there's something quite interesting about that idea of games, because games usually have a sort of controlling centre to them. And I think in particular, again, of Tom's kind of practice, where actually the group can bring its own kind of identity to it, but there's no real possibility of an individual kind of enforcing their identity on that universe. It is a shared kind of space. So I guess it comes back to that kind of this oscillation between sort of the individual and their relationship to that universe that they contribute to, and the kind of totality of those contributions that become the universe.
Yeah, I suppose a game fundamentally is pinned on to some level on the idea of rules. What are the rules of the game? Like, and obviously, yeah, that doesn't mean that there aren't meta games in which the forming of those rules is the game, or the rules are open.
Yeah.
But yeah, at some level, a game requires a kind of subset of conditions, of acceptability, of, what are within the bounds of the game. And I mean, I suppose it's interesting even to frame Tom's work as a game, because there's no sense of winning. And there's no real sense of competition either. So that was something that Anna pointed out was, I think she went into it with the intention of sort of trying to win. And then was kind of quite quickly found that it's not that kind of game. And there are a kind of genre of cooperative games and cooperative role-playing games in particular, which I think is that is kind of one avenue that you could go down in this kind of political sort of like interest in why these things might be useful. But you could say, well, if we make all games about cooperation, we'll create a generation of children that live to get on with each other. But I think, that's saying things kind of, although those games are still fun, that's kind of the same thing as sort of inviting a prescribed form of interactivity.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tom's games are much more about, they're more of a writing exercise really, and they're about what occurs during that play session.
Yeah.
And that as a activity of forming new fictions.
And I guess for me, the kind of how I think about games is probably fundamentally the rules are there potentially, but actually that they're there as models, that they are always kind of representations of something that can be pretty abstract. So the early kind of classical games of Go or chess, but they are representations of conflict. That's kind of what they're based on. Through to really linear kind of narrative games, but they stand in for something. And I think kind of maybe that's doing what's happening with Tom's, is that in some ways it gives an opportunity to model something, and that idea of kind of featuring or fictioning and universe creation, its utility presumably is around there.
Yeah, it's kind of much more like a sort of brainstorming exercise, or a kind of consciousness raising session, or I mean role play. This is the one of the things that Sarah has written about quite a bit. Is the way that role play is quite directly used in activist circles to kind of quite concretely find solutions, or play out how a certain interaction or conflict might unfold to kind of better prepare yourself for what will happen. I think maybe what I'm more interested in is just essentially kind of encouraging the part of a viewer's relationship with an artwork that provokes them to create without being asked to create. What is the thing that makes it kind of occurs, the work occurs in the context again of Mark Fisher via Slavoj Žižek talking about the cancellation of the future, and that narratives of future, and particularly optimistic futures, have all but been erased from our popular culture, and that plays out in a kind of remake and rehash Ouroboros of, and so I'm kind of thinking about what might be the sort of unintended side effects of popular culture that cause audiences to break out of that, or that, to find something in a popular culture that doesn't particularly want you to imagine your own future. What's the part of that that will provoke audiences to be active and not just a passive viewer and consumer?
So there's something really interesting there, isn't it? That idea of that moment when the big universes, I think it's Star Wars again, suddenly realise that they can co-opt and eat the content that's being generated by the people who are kind of pushing it at the edges, and that actually, to a certain extent, for all the abrasion created by some of the fans in terms of the way they produce content for these organisations, not for the organisations, but for themselves, but as part of these universes, actually it kind of facilitates and sustains the universe. There's no way out of it. And I think that's a really interesting kind of challenge in terms of thinking it through as a kind of a political as a political tool for activists or agents. I'm really interested in Sarah Jury's talk about activism, because I mean the history of role play being applied like that is through RAND, which is kind of which is a research agency based in the US, which was commissioned by the US government around war games. They kind of based on game theory stuff, but role play became a really significant part of that. But it was applied in an extremely conservative kind of authoritarian context. So I'm interested in that kind of military tech that underpins some of this. I mean, tech, little t, that kind of gets co-opted to become something which is utilised and deployed by activists as a way for simulating experience and predicting kind of development. And then how that in a kind of a real world setting allows us to kind of rupture sort of, or to a certain extent, look at ways to rupture sort of neoliberal surfaces, but actually, in the context of a universe like a fictional universe like Star Wars, the fiction makes it too robust to puncture. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I kind of ended up, I sort of began and ended up in this place as well, which was that my kind of central provocation was thinking that the future will be a spin-off, not a sequel. And the spin-off part of the research, I think, is still somewhat unexplored on my part. But thinking much more about growing something within an existing world, universe, system, which does not attempt to break out, but attempts to essentially outgrow without attempting to reach an outside. It's kind of, the Deleuze thing of like the outside is a folding of the inside. The spin-off doesn't, there are occasions where the spin-off becomes more successful and bigger than the thing that it grew out of. And to think about that as a diagram for political change, rather than we are a kind of contra arrangement or a kind of protesting arrangement, or in the case of capitalism, just kind of absorbs our attacks and grows stronger from them. Rather to grow parasitically within a cleaved space within an existing universe.
Point to end the within conversation. I think that idea suggests both the utility for the idea of futuring, but also a kind of a way through some of the impasses of universes that are created and controlled very aggressively by large corporate interests, but also suggests a model of political change in an era saturated with fictions. So, I don't know if you have any final comments, or if you'd like to
Yeah, I think that's kind of a thing that I have been thinking about this year, where it has so kind of been so tangible that we've been rendered kind of inactive, and I think has made me really reassess whether this kind of fixation on the idea of a future is necessarily the most useful place for artists and theorists and activists to be obsessed with kind of trying to reactivate a modernist notion of the future, or whether that's essentially just kind of kicking the can down the road and saying, we lay the conditions now for the better world that we hope for. In a kind of, if we were to frame it in the terms of this conversation, this research, we hope the sequel will be better. The sequel will be an improvement, but rather to work within, the conditions of now. Like, that's all we have really to work with, is the fictions, the culture that we've been given. Work with that as the material for whatever an alternative or.
Okay, I find that super useful, because I think one of the concerns I guess I have around the area, I'm obviously very interested in it, but is around this, we touched on this idea of absence, that actually allows us not to be present in whatever it is we're creating, and so to not have responsibility for it. And histories of science fiction allowed us to fundamentally escape into that. And that's a really important role that some of this has, to allow us to not be present, but it's also an abnegation of responsibility. And so that model that you're talking about is working with our present conditions to move towards something which can be achieved in the granular way rather than something which remains utopian and indefinitely postponed.
Yeah. I think that's a good summary of kind of where I'm up to with the project
Okay,
this thinking. But yeah.
fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much for the work on the project Brewing All Talks Together. It's been brilliant to work on. I'm hoping that when everyone is back in the real world, we can do some more work around this. In the meantime, do you want to give your blog address?
It's danielseankelly.wordpress.com. And I'm sort of occasionally attempting to tweet that project as well, Daniel Sean Kelly.
Brilliant, thank you. And if you're watching this, you will have found our YouTube channel, so the rest of the videos are here as well.
Yeah, watch those.
Thanks very much for watching.